The supervisor who responded to Nancy Guthrie's home the night she disappeared had never worked a homicide in his life. Not one. And a source inside the investigation is now saying that is exactly why this case went sideways from the very first hour. I am Sandra. Welcome to the True Crime Report. If you are new here, subscribe right now, because what I am about to walk you through is the most significant inside account of this investigation that has surfaced in 2 months. Let us start with what a source close to the Nancy Guthrie investigation told News Nation correspondent Brian Enton on camera, identity concealed at personal professional risk, because this account changes the entire framework for understanding how this case has unfolded. The source's words were specific and unambiguous. The people who responded to Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning she was discovered missing were not tenured homicide detectives. They did not have significant experience in homicide investigation. And the supervisor who oversaw that initial response, the person whose decisions in those critical first hours would shape everything that followed, had, according to this source, never investigated a homicide before being placed in charge of the homicide unit. Never, not once. The source's explanation for how that appointment was made: decisions by people who install friends and individuals who can do things for them, rather than people there on merit who can do the job correctly. That is not a vague institutional complaint. That is a direct accusation that Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos placed someone in charge of homicide investigations based on loyalty rather than qualifications. And the consequences of that decision, according to the source, played out in real time on the morning of February 1st, when a kidnapping scene was processed by a team without the experience to recognize what they were looking at. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore, who spent years working federal investigations and who has been one of the most consistently analytical voices covering this case, responded to that disclosure with the kind of measured alarm that comes from someone who has seen what inexperience at a crime scene actually costs. His assessment: the first people on the scene make decisions that either send the investigation in the right direction or ruin it. Evidence is perishable. He used a specific comparison. Evidence is like sushi. The first person to the restaurant gets the fresh sushi. The people who arrive the next day after it has been sitting out are not going to find anything useful. Every hour a case goes unsolved is exponentially more difficult than the hour before. And in a kidnapping case, the first 8 hours are not just important, they are everything. A supervisor who has never worked a homicide walking into that scene, not knowing what to preserve, not knowing what questions to ask, not knowing how to establish the perimeter, not knowing how to read what the absence of evidence means, is not just an inconvenience. It is a structural failure at the most critical possible moment. Here is the second disclosure from that same source, and it is in many ways even more damaging than the first. When the initial team arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home, the working theory they operated under was that she had wandered off, an 84-year-old woman, blood on the front steps, a Ring camera that had been disabled, back doors propped open, and the investigative posture of the first responding team, according to this source, was elderly woman, probably disoriented, probably wandered away from the property. The source described it as an immediate rush to judgment. They stayed with that judgment, according to the account, and then ran the investigation as if this were a search and rescue situation rather than a potential criminal scene. Think about what that means operationally. If you believe someone wandered off, you organize a perimeter search. You walk people around the exterior of the property. You have multiple individuals moving through the area around the house, the driveway, the front porch, the front walk, without treating those surfaces as a crime scene. You do not set up the kind of forensic perimeter that preserves footprints, blood deposition patterns, trace evidence on door frames and gate hardware. You are looking for a confused elderly woman in the nearby bushes. You are not looking for the person who took her.
Retired FBI agent Steve Moore was pointed on this. If you are treating the scene as a search and rescue situation, you are not thinking about tire tracks. You are not thinking about footprints. You are not looking for latent evidence on the surfaces people touched. You are not interviewing potential witnesses with the urgency that a kidnapping demands.
And the people who might be fleeing, who are at their most traceable, most locatable, most catchable in those first hours, are driving away while your team organizes a wellness check. Savannah Guthrie told investigators from the very beginning, "My mother cannot walk to her mailbox most days. She does not wander. She was not confused. Something happened to her." The family was telling them. Annie was telling them. The blood was telling them. The disabled camera was telling them. And according to this source, the initial response team stayed with the wandered off theory anyway. The crime scene question has been discussed extensively, but the specific technical consequences of what happened at that scene have not been laid out clearly enough for the public to fully grasp. Here is what actually occurred based on multiple confirmed reporting lines. The scene was processed by the initial team. Then it was released, opened back up to access. Then the FBI came back, not once, but multiple times. The perimeter that should have been maintained from the moment the first deputy arrived was not maintained. And media, including camera crews, were able to approach close enough to the front of the property to capture footage of what appeared to be blood on the front porch. That is not a minor procedural issue. That is a chain of custody catastrophe. Forensic consultant Tammy Ballard, a former DNA criminalist from San Diego PD, explained the electrostatic imaging dimension of this failure. If the interior of that house had been locked down from the moment investigators arrived, there was a real possibility of lifting footwear impressions from the floor using electromagnetic technology, prints invisible to the naked eye, but scientifically recoverable that can reveal shoe size, tread pattern, gait, and potentially a match to a specific individual. Once multiple people walk through a space, that possibility is gone. Not degraded, gone. Forensic professor Joe Scott Morgan described the doormat situation in terms that should alarm anyone following this case. The suspect, captured on the Nest camera footage, walked directly across that mat at the front entrance. If blood was present on the exterior of the house, and it was, the statistical likelihood of blood deposition on that mat and potentially on the interior floor just past the threshold was extremely high. That mat was not collected in the initial sweep. It was still there. People were walking past it. And anything it might have contained, shoe impressions, blood transfer, trace DNA, was being degraded with every passing hour. The garage is a separate and particularly troubling thread. Reports have emerged suggesting that evidence in Nancy Guthrie's garage may not have been adequately processed in the early stages of the investigation. We know that her garage was the point of entry she most commonly used, not the front door. The garage door closed at approximately 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, after she returned from Annie's house. A blue Subaru was parked inside and was eventually towed for analysis. But the garage itself, the floor, the door hardware, the surfaces Nancy would have touched routinely may not have received the forensic attention it warranted in those critical first hours. The former SWAT commander, who spent 30 years at Pima County, confirmed the standard: one way in, one way out. You preserve everything. You secure the scene. You do not release it until every surface has been documented and every potential piece of evidence has been collected and preserved. That standard was not met here. And the cost of that failure is not abstract. It is measured in evidence that can never be recovered. There is a new investigative thread that has not received the analytical attention it deserves, and it involves Bitcoin. 2 ransom notes. Savannah Guthrie confirmed publicly that she believes 2 of the communications her family received were genuine, not the flood of fraudulent attempts. 2 specific notes that she and her family responded to. She said clearly, "We will pay." At least one of those communications contained a Bitcoin address, a demand for cryptocurrency payment in exchange for Nancy Guthrie's safe return. And here is what most coverage has missed entirely. That Bitcoin address is now an active investigative lead being pursued by the FBI's Virtual Asset Unit, a specialized team of cryptocurrency tracers who have cracked ransomware operations, North Korea-linked financial crimes, and terrorist financing networks using exactly this methodology. Ari Redboard, the global head of policy and government affairs at TRM Labs, a blockchain intelligence company, and a former assistant U.S. attorney who worked terrorism and financial intelligence cases, explained the mechanics in terms that are worth understanding clearly. Every Bitcoin transaction occurs on a public blockchain. Every transaction is recorded, immutable, and traceable. The blockchain is, as Redboard described it, the ultimate crime scene, one where you can go back in time, where evidence does not degrade, where every transaction that has ever occurred involving a specific address is preserved permanently and can be analyzed. The FBI's crypto tracers use tools that take the raw blockchain data, the alphanumeric address that appeared in that ransom note, and layer it with threat intelligence. They build graphs showing funds moving across chains. They trace where those funds came from and where they went. The critical piece, the most actionable moment in a Bitcoin tracing investigation, is when the funds are eventually cashed out at a cryptocurrency exchange, because exchanges require identity verification, name, address, identification documents. When funds hit an exchange, investigators subpoena that exchange for the underlying user information. They find out what email account was used to open it. They find out what phone number. They triangulate from there. No payment appears to have been made, which means the most actionable part of the Bitcoin trail has not yet materialized. But the address exists. The FBI has it. And if anyone ever attempts to move funds through that wallet, the Virtual Asset Unit will be watching in real time. Let us look at the timeline in the way an experienced investigator would. Not at the evidence we can see, but at the gaps. The Nest camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door disconnected at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. At 2:12 a.m., the system detected a person, but no video was saved. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker lost its Bluetooth connection to her phone. At 2:36 a.m., a vehicle was captured on a Ring doorbell camera in the surrounding area. Most public attention is focused on the figure visible on the Nest camera footage, the masked individual at the front of the house, his movements, his backpack, his shoes. But the most analytically significant detail in that entire timeline may be the 2:12 a.m. entry, a system detection with no corresponding video. Something triggered that detection. The system registered a presence, but whatever occurred at that moment was not captured. That gap between the camera going down at 1:47 and the pacemaker disconnecting at 2:28 is a window of approximately 40 minutes during which the most critical events of this entire case occurred, and during which the public has essentially no visual record. A former investigator analyzing the available information made an observation that reframes how you understand the camera footage entirely. The figure on the front porch may not represent the beginning of this crime. It may represent the end of it. The actual abduction, the entry, the moment Nancy Guthrie was taken from her bed, the movement through the house may have happened entirely within that dark window before anything was visible on any camera. If that is correct, then the entire public picture of this case, focused primarily on the porch footage, has been looking at the final stage of the operation, not the first. The beginning happened in the dark, in the back of the house, through a propped open gate, when a neighborhood was asleep and the only witness was a dog 4 houses away. The investigation's leadership question has to be examined directly, not as a political sidebar, but as a factor with direct forensic consequences for this case. The source who spoke to Brian Entin described morale at the Pima County Sheriff's Office as the lowest they had ever seen. The word used was embarrassment. Deputies watching press conferences and saying internally to each other, "Please stop talking. Stop saying things." Every public statement was creating more problems than it was solving. 100% of the deputies in the union voted no confidence, not a majority, every single one. The former chief deputy, who had worked alongside Sheriff Nanos for over 40 years, 30 of them as his supervisor, then as his chief deputy when Nanos was elected, turned publicly against him. His specific charge? The searches were reactive, driven by public pressure, done because the media was watching, not because the investigative logic demanded them at that moment. That is not a personality conflict. That is an operational indictment. The FBI relationship adds another layer. Multiple sources have described the early weeks of the investigation as marked by jurisdictional friction. The sheriff's office not sharing information with federal investigators. The FBI not being given the access their resources and expertise warranted. The result was days during which the most capable investigative team in the country was operating at reduced capacity on the highest profile kidnapping case in America. The source told Entin directly, "I would ask him to step aside. The department is savable if he does. If he does not," the source implied, "the damage compounds." Retired FBI agent Steve Moore offered something important in response to all of this, something that should not get lost in the institutional criticism. He said, "There are deputies and detectives in that department who are agonizing over this, who are staying late, who are working the case with everything they have. The failure is not departmental in the broad sense. It is not an infection throughout the sheriff's office. It is a problem that originates and lives at the top. The fish, as one analyst put it in a different context, stinks at the head. But the head is not the whole fish. The DNA evidence, what exists, what has been processed, and what may still be recoverable is where the long-term resolution of this case most likely lives. Forensic DNA analyst Susanna Ryan has described the biological evidence in this case as existing in a mixed profile, meaning material from more than one person was recovered, which creates technical deconvolution challenges. Separating the profiles, identifying which biological material came from whom is a process that current technology handles with varying degrees of precision depending on the complexity of the mixture. But the mixed profile is not the end of the forensic story. It is the beginning. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore suggested something during his analysis that forensic investigators confirm as standard practice in comparable cases. Go back to the bed. Go back to the bedding. An 84-year-old woman being assisted or carried out of her bed in the middle of the night by someone who had to physically handle her creates substantial opportunity for biological transfer. Hair, skin cells, touch DNA on the pillow, the sheet, the headboard. The bite flashlight, visible in the Nest camera footage, being handled near the suspect's mouth, represents an additional DNA opportunity that Moore specifically raised. The moment that device left the suspect's mouth, anywhere inside that house, saliva was deposited. Saliva contains some of the most reliably extractable DNA available to forensic investigators. And the device was almost certainly set down or placed somewhere inside the home at some point during the 40 or more minutes the suspect was present. Forensic genealogist C.C. Moore, who has helped solve more than 300 cases, including identifying Brian Kohberger through genetic genealogy, has stated publicly that she believes this methodology will ultimately crack the Nancy Guthrie case. Her reasoning? Wherever Nancy Guthrie was held after she was taken, that location is a second crime scene. Second crime scenes produce second DNA opportunities. And wherever the perpetrators were, they left biological trace. The science, given time and the right samples, will find them. The DNA evidence is still being processed. Day 61. It is not gone, and it does not expire. There is something about Savannah Guthrie's behavior throughout this ordeal that deserves to be named, clearly, because it has been the subject of commentary ranging from admiring to critical. And the truth of it matters. She went back to work. She has spoken publicly. She has kept her mother's name in front of the country. She has done all of this while carrying something that has no clean name: the suspended, unresolved grief of not knowing what happened to someone you love. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore described Savannah Guthrie as, in his assessment, the ideal victim family member in a situation like this. Not because her pain is somehow lesser or more manageable, but because of how she has channeled it. She has not attacked law enforcement publicly. She has not alienated the investigators who are working the case. She has expressed on camera her belief that they are working tirelessly. She has kept pressure on the investigation without creating the kind of adversarial dynamic that causes investigations to close down, become defensive, and slow. Moore said something specific that should not be overlooked. Every time Savannah Guthrie says publicly that law enforcement is working hard, the people inside that department who are staying late, who are going over the evidence for the 40th time, who are building on the case day by day, they feel that. It motivates them. It makes them not want to go home until they have found the next piece of information. She vowed not to fall apart. She said she would not take her children's mother away from them. That is not a statement made from someone who is not in agony. It is a statement made by someone who has chosen, deliberately and at great personal cost, to keep moving, to keep fighting, to keep her mother's name alive in a country that might hold the answer. That is a form of strength that deserves more than it has been given. Here is where this investigation stands at day 61. And here is what the assembled evidence suggests about where it is going. The case was compromised in its first hours. An inexperienced supervisor on a scene that should have been handled by the most seasoned investigators available. A rush to judgment toward a wandered-off theory that delayed the recognition of a crime scene. Evidence that was not fully preserved, a perimeter that was released and re-accessed multiple times, a garage that may not have been fully processed, a doormat that was not collected. These failures do not mean the case cannot be solved. They mean the path to solving it is harder than it should have been, and that whoever did this has benefited from investigative errors they did not earn and did not plan for. But here is what also exists. DNA evidence still being processed through genealogical databases that have identified killers who evaded justice for decades. A Bitcoin address associated with what Savannah Guthrie believes are genuine ransom demands now being tracked by a federal team of cryptocurrency tracers who operate in real time. Cell tower and geofencing data from multiple dates, January 11th, January 24th, February 1st, that may already identify device patterns placing specific phones in specific locations at specific times. Contractor work orders and interviews still being conducted, a process described as messy but ongoing, aimed at identifying every person who had legitimate or informal access to that property. And the pressure of $1 million plus reward that does not decrease with time. It builds. The source who came forward to Brian Enton at personal professional risk against the instinct that law enforcement develops over years of training not to trust the media did so because they believed the public deserved to know what had gone wrong, because the silence was not serving Nancy Guthrie. Because accountability, even painful accountability, was the only honest path forward. They asked the sheriff to step aside. They said the department was savable. They said the deputies inside that building were with Savannah Guthrie and her family, not with the failures of their leadership. That is worth something. It is proof that the people doing the actual work of this investigation have not given up, have not gone through the motions, are still fighting, still searching, still trying to find Nancy Guthrie in the spaces between the failures that have defined this case publicly. The reward is over $1 million. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Anonymous. No arrest required. No conviction required. One phone call. If you are carrying something, a detail, a conversation, a thing you saw in that neighborhood on a night that now means something different, that number is the most important thing in front of you right now. Nancy Guthrie was taken from the house she lived in for 50 years. Her daughter is standing at an anchor desk every morning carrying the weight of not knowing. Her grandchildren are being shielded from a truth that cannot be held back indefinitely. And the person responsible is out there, living with 61 days of this, knowing the net is still moving, knowing that every day without an arrest is borrowed time rather than permanent safety. Cases like this one break. They break slowly and then all at once. They break when one piece connects to another, when a DNA profile finds a match, when a Bitcoin wallet moves, when the person who has been sitting on information for 2 months finally decides that $1 million or a clear conscience or the weight they cannot carry anymore is worth a phone call. If this video gave you something, a perspective, a detail, a reason to keep paying attention, share it right now. Like it so it reaches more people. And if the True Crime Report is new to you, subscribe. We stay on the cases that matter until there are answers. I am Sandra. This is the True Crime Report. Thank you for watching.